Turn Signals is about current issues facing site stewardship. And this seemed like a perfect panel for me to moderate. As the director of Passaquan, really, and a representative of CSU, I am really a rookie at this. And I thought, wow, this is something I should be involved in. And when Peter Rosen asked me to do it, I said, yeah, perfect. I mean, this panel sounds like a group of people that has a lot of information to share, and I couldn't wait to take part in it. So the panelists are going to discuss things like administration, project management, conservation, tourism, zoning laws, landscaping, historic preservation, marketing, and public relations. So let me first quickly introduce our panelists, and then we're going to get right into the discussion with Erica Nelson. So to my left here, I have Erica Nelson. She is going to discuss SP Dismore's Garden of Eden in Lucas, Kansas. She is an independent artist and educator, and I'm going to probably mess this up, but she's the creator, and I love this thing. She's the creator of the world's largest collection, of the world's smallest version, of the world's largest things, traveling roadside attraction and museum, and it's here right now in Sheboygan. I saw it in a parking lot a couple hours ago. So if you get a chance, ask her about that. I met Erica about 2 years ago when she was doing the restoration of Passaquan. She worked on that. And when I found out she has been involved in site stewardship for years, I took her out for a beer. And I realized if I take her out for a beer, she will give me a lot of knowledge. And she was so generous if I bought her beer. And she has given me so much to think about and help me deal with the challenges that I was going to face as the new director of Passaquan. To the left of her, we have Peter Tokowski. He is going to talk about the rise and fall of Kim Fahey's Phonehenge West. Yesterday evening, I talked to him on the phone. I said, so what do you want me to say in your introduction? He said, well, just one thing. How do we steward a site that primarily does not exist? I thought this is going to be interesting. But I will talk a little more about Peter. Peter is a senior public program specialist at the John Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles, an associate adjunct professor of Germanic languages at UCLA. Previously, Peter was the director of Craft and Folk Art Museum in Los Angeles and an independent curator of exhibitions. So Peter's going to again talk about a little bit the rise and fall of Phonehenge West. To the left of him, we have Alex Gardelman. He's going to discuss the developing strategies and stewardship of long-term care of the Mary Knoll House. Many of you probably know the Mary Knoll House. It's about 45 minutes away. Alex is currently the exhibition program coordinator at the John Michael Kohler Art Center. Alex is also an amazing artist. Some of you saw him discuss some of his artwork yesterday in a panel. I was just so impressed with his collaborative works. He's exhibited widely across the United States. He received his BFA from the University of the Arts in Philadelphia and his MFA from the School of Art Institute in Chicago. And again, he's going to talk to us a little bit about the challenges at the Mary Knoll House. And then to his left, we have someone with a lot of knowledge about preservation, Jim Drager. Jim is Wisconsin State's Historic Preservation Officer. He has a wealth of knowledge to share with us. He's going to discuss the relationship between artist-built environments and the more mainstream historic preservation movements. He's going to cover principles, strategies, and practices of historic preservation, preservation advocacy, National Register of Historic Places, historic structures and reports, and much more. No pressure, Jim. That's a lot to cover. But I think without any further discussion from me, we're going to turn this over to Erica Nelson and begin this panel discussion. So again, thank you for attending, and we hope you can stick around and add some questions at the end.
And clicker advice.
Arrow, right.
This one? Okay. Hey, Hey, look, there I am. Sweet.
I should have done that for you, sorry.
That's right. So I live next door to a turn of the last century folk art environment called the Garden of Eden. And I'd been familiar with artist-built environments throughout my graduate work and as an exercise in keeping myself sane while teaching grad school. I would take trips to find these places that feed me back. And this Garden of Eden was always one in that little central road trip where you could tell something was different. Something wasn't being taught to us as students, and we weren't teaching them as instructors. They were inherent in these sites, in these little tiny rural towns in Kansas. So I kept circling back to this place until I finally landed in Lucas while living in the bus full-time on the road for 2 years, searching for integrated arts communities in a rural setting. I'd spanned up and down the Midwest, over to the West Coast, but kept coming back to the center and went to an auction, and a house sold for $1,200. And I thought, you can buy a house in Kansas for cash that has like a roof and plumbing and electricity? And so I started looking at property, and the house right next door to this place that had served as this source of inspiration was for sale. And I called up, and I ended up purchasing the house right next door to this turn of the century folk art environment for less than the price of a used car. So this is just happenstance that I now live next to this thing. So this is my neighbor. I see him every day. And in seeing something every day, you forget. You forget so easily because you're thinking about what bill's going to be at the post office, and you're thinking about, I just almost stepped in that dog poop on my way. And so you forget about these sites as something phenomenal until somebody comes in to see it and gives you that energy back. So our site is so developed on tourism because that's how Dinsmore intended it. And that's also what reminds us site stewards that these places are frickin' amazing. And they're your neighbors. Your neighbors are making these. Your neighbors come from the same place that you are. You could make one of these environments. So this is why I live in Lucas. For those of you not familiar with the Garden of Eden, Samuel Perry Dinsmore was a Civil War veteran, born in Ohio, but then near Coolville, also home to James Dean, I believe. And he built this 2-story log cabin made out of the only building material that was available in our area, which is a layer of limestone. We don't have trees, but we have rock. And so he decided to treat that rock like you would a tree, and had hewn out these giant logs, massive logs of limestone, dovetailed into a log cabin form. Then after that, he started embellishing his environment with 3-story concrete structures that reflect populist party politics of the turn of the last century. So not Sarah Palin populism. This is populism that grew out of the Farmers Alliance, so a much different beast. And he did this he built the house as an oddity and always had it open for tours. And the sculptures ended up being a way to expand this sort of home-built environment into a story. The reason that it's called the Garden of Eden was because of the railroads. The railroads convinced pockets of immigrants to come out into the middle of Kansas, and they said, all right, when you're on the train, you can throw seeds out the train window, and by the time you get your bags and get to your homestead, they'll already be growing. That's the kind of Garden of Eden this is. Such a lie. I mean, you can't grow crap there unless you're really, really messing with the soil. I mean, this is High Plains Prairie. This is where the buffalo roam. These are hard to reach areas. And so the Farmers Alliance joined to get these, to teach each other how to work the land and actually not die on your homestead property. So that's why it's called the Garden of Eden. So Dinsmore did start out illustrating some of those Garden of Eden stories just as a moral philosophy. And he started building out of this new material called Portland cement. His innovations with the use of Portland cement were so important at the time that he was using them, that they got written up in trade journals of the time. So Cement Era magazine did an article on Dinsmore's work, because this was supposed to be a structural application, not a sculptural application. So his expansion of this very practical material into a sculptural medium was really mind-blowing. He worked on the house up until 1907 and worked on the sculptures from 1907 until a little bit before his death in 1932. And he started out illustrating some of the Garden of Eden story because that was the title of the environment. But at a corner post, he said, I'm going to only illustrate what's real now because I don't believe in God or perpetual motion or anything else that can't be proven. So now I'm going to take this other bend on this other street side set of sculptures. And this is where the political cartooning in 3D form really started. So you'll see octopus with the word trust written across his belly and those tentacles reaching around a globe to take control of the Panama Canal, to start controlling the trade industries. Another tentacle eating a bag of interest because that's what they were getting fed on. It's supported by a limb labeled chartered rights because of the rights that we chartered away to the bank trust. And that was fueling this whole big social Darwinism that he illustrated in concrete form at the turn of the last century. So that octopus has a tentacle around a woman who is reaching for a soldier. That soldier is aiming down his gun at the next tree, but the octopus also is controlling that soldier's food supply so he can control the armies of the world. That soldier sighting down his gun is shooting at a Native American who has his bow and arrow pulled back so he can shoot a dog that's after a cat, that's after a bird, that's after a worm, that's eating a leaf. That was this big, long political thing. This was not built as an art environment. This was built as political cartooning. This was built as a lesson for visitors. He knew that you needed to have that flim-flam to get people in, a reason to stay, but then while you're there, through entertaining storytelling, he could actually affect social change. So this is a really unique environment, and I think people sort of gloss over it because it's called Garden of Eden, but this is populist party politics at the turn of the last century in rural Kansas. It's a really strange, amazing, beautiful place. So these sculptures are 100 years old. Concrete, Portland cement, mixed with native minerals for the coloration. And we did do a massive restoration project. And one of our first things that happened was cleaning these 100-year-old sculptures and realizing that the colors in these sculptures are not paint, but they're within the structures themselves. So by mixing white Portland and gray Portland and minerals from the area, you could get this whole range of whites through grays through reds, and that's what made up these sculptures, so that that color is inherent and the text comes out. And when they're clean, they're beautiful and vibrant and almost like printed word. He does go on to major tableaus in the back that talk about how to affect social change. We have voters exercising their right to vote with a crosscut saw labeled ballot that's taking down those chartered rights that will take down the bank trust. The bank trust octopus has already been stabbed in the head by the goddess of liberty, saying that this is how you free yourself to do more work. And then on the surrounding trees, because he was building this at the turn of the last century, he has the disenfranchised folks. He has a black man pointing to liberty saying, I deserve that right too. He has an immigrant laborer pointing to liberty saying, I deserve that right too. He has a woman who is unmarried and has no land pointing to liberty saying, I deserve that right too. And he gave all of them a path to liberty with the hopes that they would actually be able to attain that goal that everybody else took for granted. So this is a teaching tool today. And any time that we tell the story to somebody else, we're reminded of the story ourselves. I sometimes get into tour guide mode and I can sort of hear this audible click in my head when it's like, oh, are you even listening to what you're saying? Oh, you're just doing the tour now. It's so easy to slip into the language and the jargon of the places that we caretake and forget the reason that we do all of these. And it takes those visitors' eyes as a reminder that, holy crap, this is my neighbor. It's so great. I love it. One of his things that he did to assure the continuation of his site, because he did know that people would come to visit, he knew that to really make it something that would draw people in, he built a mausoleum for himself and had himself interred in a coffin with a glass front. So he built his coffin. He would pose in his coffin for an extra quarter whenever he was giving tours. At some point, he was called on tax evasion because he was running an attraction but not not paying an attraction tax. So he stopped charging admission but started requiring that you buy 4 postcards before he would talk to you about the environment. So anyway, he built his own concrete coffin. This is a double exposed photograph that he had produced of himself outside the coffin looking in and inside dead. So he was using all the tricks in this very serious way, in this humorous way, to get a political message across. When he died, he was interred in his coffin, placed in the mausoleum and placed behind glass. And he wrote in his will that he wanted this done so that people couldn't see his body for less than $1. And if he saw you drop $1 into the hands of the flunky, which is usually me, he might even just give you a smile. So he looked at that need for admission and fantasticality to pay for upkeep of this site. And so it's been operated as a tourist attraction, not every single year, but there's been some ups and downs, some ebbs and flows. But that's always been written into the building of the site itself. One of the other fantastic stories is his very young, beautiful wife. When he was 81, he married his 20-year-old housekeeper, and they did have 2 children together. Their son, John, just passed away within the last 4 years, and John Dinsmore was the youngest surviving offspring of a Civil War veteran. So there are so many superlatives attached to this site. It makes for some great storytelling. So in some year fairly recently, I think it was 2011, Kohler Foundation was there for the rescue because Dinsmore made the environment went to his second wife, depression hit, she couldn't keep up with it. Garden was sold to the daughter of the first marriage, who was older than the second wife, didn't like the second family. She transferred the site to a money-making scheme that was not based on tourism or the sculptures. She turned it into a rental unit. Outside sculptures were forgotten. Folk art was an embarrassment at that time. So there were trees and vines growing up through these sculptures. You couldn't even see it. And it wasn't until I think it was the Kansas Centennial or maybe Sesquicentennial. The local booster club was like, oh, we've got this thing and we've never really torn it down, but it looks pretty crappy. Let's go in there and clean it up and see what's under. And they started revealing that the sculptures were okay. That neglect had almost saved them. The fact that his body was there scared the local kids enough that they were like, I'm not going in there. I dare you to go in there. People would run past when it was overgrown. So this sort of mystique in building it also saved it. A local man bought it from the bank. He was going to continue the rental unit until his wife saw it and went, no, we're going to save this. We're going to restore it. We're going to turn it back into a tourist attraction. So they took out all the infrastructure that made it into apartments, restored it back to what Dinsmore intended in their methods that they had. They ran it for 22 years and retired. A second group of owners saw this advertised in the farm paper, the free one at the coffee shop that has really big monster trucks and hay equipment and free goats. Then there's a listing for historic tourist attraction. And a man who'd grown up in that area, still had family in the area, but was now teaching at the University of Kansas, saw it and went, whoa, this can't be the garden advertised on the back of the Farm Journal. He called up and it was. So he got a group of people to band together their cash, bought it, and they ran it as a business for the next 22 years. At that point, they knew that the sculptures were in great shape, but on the verge of becoming a problem and not so great shape. And while we had been doing admission that whole time, it wasn't enough to do that full top to bottom, let's break into it in a conservationally way, not breaking things, but let's repair and bring this back to full standards of conservation. And the only way that could happen was with Kohler Foundation help. So negotiated between that second 22-year owner. Kohler took it over, and we spent a year and a half on the site, and then it was gifted to a new nonprofit that was formed specifically to caretake the Garden of Eden into the next 100 years. So while the site is 100 years old, the Friends of S.P. Dinsmore's Garden of Eden is only 5. So we are a very young organization. We've tried to honor the legacy of everybody before us. We do have one of those older owners on our board as a continuation of the knowledge of the relationships that have been up through the relationships that we can build now and move forward on. But it's a much more dynamic board because on its very foundation, we knew we had to be careful with how we structured our next steps so that it doesn't become this one person's voice. It becomes Dinsmore's voice, aided by all of us as facilitators into the next century, so that it can be perpetually turned over and perpetually in care. And that Kohler Foundation restoration was the turning point for this site in the middle of a town of 400 people that would not have had this resource, but has springboarded us into where we should be, or approaching where we should be in stewardship. Yeah, look at those colors. This is the before and after of just washing them. And the town was like, what? Why did you guys paint everything? It's like, no, this was here. And they're like, everybody has nipples. They're blushing and have eyebrows. She looks plucked. These forms have underwear. You can see through the holes that are intentional and see that he built a structure and then he clothed it and then he clothed it again. So just in cleaning and doing that careful restoration that doesn't break anything else around it and is obvious enough that you can tell, all right, original. All right, that's where the original stops, but we can see the continuation. So it's that same team of people mixing cookies of the local clay and the white Portland through the gray Portland and physically taking those around and matching them until everything is right. And using historic photographs to put the pieces back together in the least wrong that we can do. This is a shot from right before a 40-minute hailstorm that pummeled Lucas. And luckily, Garden of Eden fared okay. We've got a lot of pointing fingers that are broken. So we've got a lot of stumps going on. And we do have a roof that needs to be done by the end of the year. But this is a National Register of Historic Places sites. I don't remember if Watts Tower is like a month ahead or behind us. Behind. Sorry. So let you into that one. Our lighting was destroyed, and we've got some fingers to work on. But with that National Register designation, I think our new board is really thinking about this in a global context. And while there is not a guidebook for restoration for these sites, I do think that is very much in our talks and plans as we fix things and document the fixing through each era and make available those resources. So that's my neighbor. See him every day. It takes you guys to remind us that they're awesome. Thanks.
So first of all, I want to again just thank the organizers, Valerie and Peter and everyone else who's been responsible for making this conference so great. One of the things I do at the Getty Museum is I help organize our conferences, and I wish they ran as smoothly as this one does. I'm going to try to be fairly brief because I think the conversations are among the best part of what we do here. I want to talk about a site outside of the city of Los Angeles in northern Los Angeles County. It's called Phonehenge West, and the name isn't that meaningful. Kim Fahey, who created it, who you see here, spent his entire working career working for the phone company, so he has a relationship with phones. And as you can see in this picture, he makes liberal use of retired telephone and utility poles. So it got the name Phonehenge stuck, but then he learned about this site somewhere in the eastern half of the United States where someone's taken British phone booths and arranged them in the shape of Phonehenge, which goes by the name of, in the shape of Stonehenge, and they call it Phonehenge. So he dubbed this Phonehenge West. It was in Acton, California, marked there. One of the remarkable things about this site is that probably about 10 million people live within 50 miles of it. And as far as I know, only his immediate neighbors knew it existed. He started building it in the early 1980s and worked on it for about 30 years. When I first went to see it, we went to Acton. I didn't have an exact address. And Acton is a small place, and we drove into the town. And when you see a picture, more pictures of it, you'll see that we thought that it would be easily visible and we would find it. We couldn't see it, so we went into town, and we had to ask about 20 people before someone could actually point us in the right direction. So when Kim retired from the phone company, he bought a property in Acton, and this house, without the bridge on the left there, was on the property. Kim is a guy who is very restless and always needs to be doing something. So in retirement, he set to work, and he decided that the one building was not enough. And over the course of 30 years, he built over a dozen additional buildings and connected them with a series of bridges and ramps, and was always very eager to welcome guests to the site. So I'm just going to do a quick tour of some of these buildings. Almost all of the materials that he used were repurposed, found, traded for, acquired in various ways, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. At one point, he was in a motorcycle accident, so he started building the additional units for his children, and he's a guy that just people come and stay there, and his kids had friends, and so he wanted everyone to have their own little space, so he built small structures. At one point after his motorcycle accident, Kim was briefly confined to a wheelchair, and it wasn't certain whether he would walk again, so it was partly for himself that he started building the bridges and ramps so he could get from one structure to another. He's also a collector of all kinds of things, from vintage Tonka trucks to rocks to plastic toys, and they were scattered throughout the grounds as well. The project culminated in what he called the tower. This is in the front of all those other buildings, and it was the height of about a 3-story building. Also built with lots of utility poles and all kinds of found materials, glass from demolition sites. Every element there has a story, and we'll talk more about that. This is the front of the tower. To get to it, you would have to go up his scissor lift because there was no ground floor. So here he is on a typical day. Some people have shown up, and he takes them up into the tower. And it's beautiful high desert country there, so if you go on the right day, you can not only get nice pictures, but you can really enjoy the landscape. Now, the way most of us became aware of it, people like myself, was because eventually, around 2009, 2010, Phonehenge made it into the Los Angeles Times. And the reason it was one of the most viewed stories in the Times in 2011 was because finally, the building department, the Los Angeles County Building Department, heard about this. The tower kind of drew their attention, and taking people up to unpermitted building on a scissors lift will tend to draw the scrutiny of building inspectors. Of course, then they got there and they saw that he had about a dozen other unpermitted buildings. And so that started an extended process of them trying to make him cease and desist, and that's not going to work with Kim Fahey. So there was a lot of reportage in the paper about what was going on. He was eventually put on trial. for building code violations because he refused to meet their demands. And it was eventually he was sentenced to jail, and the building was condemned for demolition. He did serve. He was sentenced for several months. He served 6 days in Los Angeles County Twin Tower Prison. Let's say he was one of the less hardened criminals in that facility. He does like to say that he thinks he would have served fewer than 6 days. However, it was in December, and he made such a good Santa Claus that the sheriffs wanted him to stick around for their holiday party. And he also likes to say that when other inmates asked him what he was in for, he said building a treehouse. So he became known as Santa Claus who built a treehouse. So that's the introduction. The reality is our story could end there. The verdict was executed. We had some video here, but it's not working. But if you go online, you can find video of Stonehenge West being torn down. So there's nothing there anymore. So in a way, I appreciate the organizers of the panel putting me on a panel about stewardship, because it's not something I thought about myself doing, even if it were there. But now it's not there, and so it gives me a chance to ponder what really is our role in working with sites. And I think there's a lot of things about this site and probably comparable stories elsewhere that still warrant stewardship. For one thing, Kim Fahey is still alive, and we like to talk about the makers along with the objects. So this is an amazingly creative and industrious person. We should still be interested in him, even though he doesn't live in this facility anymore. So Kim's a person of interest, but there's other things too. He did this remarkable thing. I don't know of many other instances of this, but not only did he get up at the crack of dawn and work on the site until after dark, until his wife would say, "You've got to come back in," but when he was done doing that, he would sit down and keep a journal of everything he did on the site that day. So there's these incredible volumes, which he still has, and I truly hope they'll end up in a museum at some point. So we can get the history of Stonehenge and the building of Stonehenge in great detail. And then scattered throughout these journals are also clippings, not only about Stonehenge when it made it into the news, but things that he was interested in an uneven day and that he had seen in newspapers, internet, magazines, and he would paste them in there. He also is a model builder, so building 12 structures, a 3-story tower isn't enough to keep him busy. He built models. Some are fantasy models, some are models of Stonehenge, and many of these still exist. He's given away a lot of them, but I think some of them are still in his possession, and the others can be found, and they too, I think, should be preserved in a museum, talking about the incredible creativity of a unique individual. Here he is with the model of Stonehenge. So Kim moved out of Los Angeles County and moved to the north to Kern County, on what he now calls Stonehenge North. When he first moved there, he vowed to rebuild the exact same thing. It took him 30 years to build. He's in his 60s. Nobody really thought he could pull it off. And then there was a question of whether he should build the exact same thing or not. About a year after moving there, he also had a stroke. So he's lost the use of his right arm. And I think because a number of people have doubted that he could build much of anything there, he seems more determined than ever to build stuff. And so he's busy and he's working. So I'll get into this a little bit more, but you see the perimeter fencing there is something that he put up himself. The main structure there was on the property. It's a shed, but he's done a lot there, and I have a few more pictures. Here's his chicken coop. He's still using telephone poles. He thought he had an arrangement with the demolition company to preserve materials from Stonehenge West. If you watch the video, he talks about that. And he believes they went in there with a vengeance to destroy any usable material. So there's very little that he was able to preserve from Stonehenge West. So these are all things that he's had to acquire subsequently. And then the most important thing, I think, about this site, but in thinking about sites, is stories. So not only do we have the journals where he records everything, Kim is an incredible storyteller. He self-published a book about his stories when he was installing phones in Hollywood and in Los Angeles. But the greatest stories are the stories of how he gets his materials for these structures. And so what came down when Phonehenge came down were materials, each one of which had a long story embedded in it. So I'm embarking on a project. It's hard to keep him on track with this, but to tell the story of how every major building component of Phonehenge was acquired. This is his, as it turns out, in Phonehenge North, he has a different artistic vision. He's very interested in birdhouses right now. He's discovered Pinterest, and he's using that for a source. And he also invented this, he came up with this colored pencil idea. So he's buying these dowels at Home Depot and sharpening and painting them, and those are going to be along the perimeter fence. And they're going to actually, this is one of the towers along the perimeter fence. He calls them Hobbit Towers. And the main gates are going to be the colored pencil gates, and they're not up yet. But mind you, he's doing this with one hand, one arm, and it's not his natural arm. So there he is, you see. So he's got his right arm has not been used, but he loves tools. He wanted a picture of him with a tool. So these are some old shots of Phonehenge West. So all of these materials had back histories and how they got there. And that's one of the remnants that he could salvage from Phonehenge West. And when I told him I wanted to talk about the stories that were embedded in Phonehenge West, he said, "Oh, you want stories from Phonehenge?" And he pulled out this binder, which is separate from his journals, and he said, "These are all stories I wrote down while I was building Phonehenge." And I'm going to just finish with one typical story about how he gets these materials. This is actually a recent story. It's a Phonehenge North story, not a Phonehenge West story. But the circles on that perimeter fence are from cable spools, wooden cable spools. And not far from where he lives, there's a wood reclamation center where people bring used wood, and it gets chipped up and it gets put onto landscape and so forth. And he, it's the kind of place that he loves to go. So he was up there one day, and some guy sees his truck, which is this nice mid-sized Ford flatbed, and says, "Hey, your truck's the perfect size. Mine's too big. Would you mind taking a load of chips up to my property for me?" And, Kim loves an adventure like that. I said, "Sure, no problem." So they load up his truck. He ends up taking him 2 loads of chips, and they start talking, and it turns out the person who requested this was actually the owner of the reclamation site. And Kim said, "Hey, I see all those cable spools lying around. Do you mind if I took a few?" And the guy's like, "Sure, how many do you want?" And Kim's telling me, he ran through his head and said, "Well, how many could I ask for that I think he'd really give it to me?" So he said 20. He took 20. He said, the guy said yes, and Kim's thinking, I should have asked for more. And he went and he painted them, he put them on the first segment of fence, and sometime later, the owner of the reclamation site drove by and really liked what Kim was doing and said to him, "Hey, you could take more if you want." So he's taken several hundred now. And a lot of them are lying around on the site. They can't be chipped because they have metal in them. So they were at the reclamation site. And so he's using those. I think there's about 150 on the perimeter fence. He hasn't quite figured out what to do with the remainder, but he likes to talk about the form of his work following the materials. So he gets what he can, and he puts them into use on the site. And really, that story is kind of paradigmatic. Every tale he has about his materials start with him meeting somebody, chatting them up. Often it's someone whose truck is broken down by the side of the road. He picks them up. It's how he got these new telephone poles. As one of the guys working on the replacement of telephone poles, his truck broke down on the way to work. Kim gave him a lift, and they started talking. And it's always, if you want this stuff and you can haul it away, you take it. Sometimes he takes stuff because he sees a barter potential in it. So he might not need 400 wooden spools, but he thinks that maybe they could be traded for some boulders at some point or something like that. So the story continues. There's all of these stories that still exist in non-material form from Phonehenge West. There are new stories emerging in Phonehenge North. And as stewards, we can think about gathering that stuff as well, not just documenting the physicality. And also, what's interesting about Stonehenge North, and I want to say this is my last point, as stewards, we're usually willing to restore, but can we work in a forward-looking way and say, the man is there, he's got a vision for the site, could we help him build it? Can we help build Stonehenge North rather than just saving it after he's gone? Thanks.
I'm Alex Gardelman. I work for the John Michael Kohler Art Center, and I think kind of similarly to how Erica landed next to Mr. Dinsmore, I, through a series of unforeseen and serendipitous circumstances, have ended up living in Mary Knoll's house. So, living and working in Mary Knoll. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the site, it is located in Fox Point, Wisconsin, which is about 45 miles south of here. The house is 60 feet off of Lake Michigan, and I think of the house in 4 phases. So there's in 1924, her family erected a summer cottage that was a Sears kit cottage close to the road. In 1930, they moved that cottage off the road and built an unconnected garage. And then in 1943, when her parents retired, who were living in Milwaukee at the time, they built that larger structure that you see in the middle to connect the cottage and the garage. The 4th phase is starting in 1963, when Mary's mother was moved into assisted living. She began turning the property into the environment that we now know as the Mary Knoll Home and Artist Environment. So this photo, which is undated, as many of the photos are, it gives you a sense of what the house looked like while she was working on the environment. So it's from sometime between 1963 and 2001. She, as sometimes is maddening for us who are working on the site, did not like to date anything because she felt that nothing was ever potentially finished, so she could always have this opportunity to come back into anything she was working on. And so it is often hard to track where things land in the history of the site. So Mary died in 2001. In 1996, this is another view. In 1996, she gifted the home and all of its contents to the Kohler Foundation, and that when she would pass, that thus the home, the property, and all of its contents would come to the foundation, and that $11.3 million would be donated to the Greater Milwaukee Foundation to be used as annual artist grants for artists in the 3 counties around Milwaukee, or maybe just Milwaukee County, 3 counties. The house in 2012 was turned over to the John Michael Kohler Art Center to be the steward for the site, and in 2015 it underwent a major renovation because it was in pretty rough shape, where the roof was replaced, the windows were replaced, all the mechanicals were replaced, and we actually had to rebuild from scratch the 1924 cottage because it suffered quite a bit of damage during a massive flooding event that happened in 2010 that put 4 feet of standing mud in the basement. And also there was extensive termite damage where our former collections manager actually fell through the floor into the crawl space. And so it was decided that that section of the house actually needed to be totally rebuilt for the health of the building itself. This is a view from the lake looking at the house, so that's the eastern face. The property is 1.36 acres. It is populated with 40-some concrete sculptures that have been under a relative constant conservation effort since about 2003. This summer we had a conservation crew there working on the sculptures for about 6 weeks, and we just develop a priorities list for where things are at because they need constant work, because Mary built them with sand and stone from the beach and probably Portland cement as her concrete mix, and none of them have actual armatures. They are just stone stacked and mudded with concrete. So it's actually amazing that they still are standing because the property shifts so much because of where it's located. And there's also lots of pine trees, which she built sculptures close to when they were smaller, and now they are bigger and encroaching, and the roots are also encroaching on the foundations. She also didn't really build foundations for anything, so that's another issue. So this is what the house looked like in 2010. These are photos from 2010. Excuse me, these are photos from 2015, right before the renovation happened. So you can see that there's a large amount of artwork on the exterior of the home. And so before the renovation happened, all of the artwork on the exterior of the home was removed. She nailed everything to the outside of the house, so it was a long process to safely get everything off. Like how she built the concrete sculptures, she was not necessarily concerned with the archival nature of the work with which she was doing, and so all of the work on the exterior of the house is made from pine, mounted on masonite, and so over the course of its life on the exterior of the house, which sits right on the lake in Wisconsin, where we have really pleasant weather during the winter, it has suffered a great deal of degradation, and so we are in the process of assessing all of that artwork, prioritizing it for critical pieces to go back on the house in a certain order while we do reproduction work on those pieces to put them back in a manner that will have a lasting life, well beyond kind of what the pine and masonite would offer. One of the interesting things is that as we go through the pile of stuff in our collection storage, oftentimes we find that these masonite backings were existing paintings that Mary had made that she then decided to just cut down and use as her backing panel. So as we flip them over to look at them, we are unveiling new paintings that have not been seen, which is exciting. So this is now, this is from this summer, and so this is a massive project, and we've had to kind of compartmentalize it. And so there was so much damage to the cedar siding on the house that she had painted the house, of the entire exterior and the entire interior, using carpet squares as a sponge application. So one carpet square at a time, over and over and over again. And so I spent about 6 weeks doing a pretty extensive research on every different pile of carpet available with different paint densities and different colors and different types of paint to try to understand her method, which in a lot of ways I still don't. And I wish I had the book of notes because Mary kept extensive journals in these 5-year journals. So every page has the same date for 5 years, which leads you about 8 lines to describe what you've done that day. And so the specifics within her process are rare. So we're doing the best that we can with the information that we have and working from the fairly large collection of photographs of the house over time. So the house was reprimed because we had to put so much new siding on it. And so the focus this summer, I've been there full time since the end of June, has been to get the exterior of the house repainted before our weather turns to be less amenable towards that activity. So 2 coats of white exterior, and then areas that have color, we put a coat of color on that, and then the texture treatment, so that using the highest quality, highest solid count exterior paints that we can to try to extend the life of that beyond, because she was painting with whatever she had on top of an unclean surface, and so there was massive amounts of delamination and degradation to her paint treatment. So we're going to try to avoid that. So you can see on the eastern face of the garage there behind those sculptures, that is my paint treatment. So, but you can see the texture, the kind of mark making that she was kind of creating. So, so this is what we've done. This is in process this summer. So also spending a great deal of time color matching, finding locations of the house that we can unobtrusively take paint chips off. I have a really great paint guy who is able to match color for me in an exceptional way. So if you find a paint guy, it makes your life so much easier. And so this is where we're at the end of the summer, and I'm almost done around the back of the house as well. And so As we move into the less amenable weather, I will move into the reproduction phase of a lot of the exterior artworks, working with cedar, stainless hardware, and an E-panel, which is a composite polyethylene cord panel that will replace the masonite. And so that all of these things will be mounted back on the house with brackets that we can remove each panel if we need to, and then individual components from each panel. So if work needs to be done or we need something for research purposes, we have those things. So in addition to the exterior, the interior of the home is fully treated by Mary's hand. All of her furniture, it's laden with objects. That's an understatement. And then all of the furniture is treated with her hand. And so as a part of this exhibition series this year, we exhibited Mary's living room. And so that furniture has actually just come back. But the picture window that you see there below the fish, that entire wall had to be replaced because it faces the lake and it was under duress. And so this is what it looked like replaced when I got there this summer. And so it needed to be repainted. And so these are my test samples of different piles of carpet and paint, color matching. So we're bracketing colors based off of the color palette that I get, and in places where we can't get a large enough sample. And then this is the retreatment. So we've brought the furniture back. So all that painting work has been done. That's not Mary's original hand, to match what she had there. So in lots of other sections of the interior of the house, there was a lot of plaster damage that was repaired. So we will also have to be matching into those locations. And that will, again, happen when the weather changes. And so we will work in phases to kind of phase in the first floor of the house so that we can use the second floor as staging. And then once the first floor is phased in, we'll stage in the second. We will phase in the furniture into the second floor of the house. So the site has been under what I will refer to as nuanced and complicated local politics. And it is closed to the public, and I live there as the tenant to restore it because Fox Point is 90+% residential zoning, and it is almost impossible to get commercial zoning in there. And so we would have to get a cultural overlay and change the zoning to allow for public access. And so there are some neighbors who are not amenable to that idea, and we are working to engage the community of Fox Point to find agency in the site within their own community, so it's not just some institution coming in and laying claim to this land, but that the community feels engaged. They feel that it's an important part of their story as well, so that we can kind of change the narrative around the site from being this possible nuisance to the neighborhood that's going to bring in all this traffic, which is an erroneous claim as someone who now lives there full time, so that we can find a way to get people access to the site because it is an important site, and there are so few sites that are built by women, and that this is such an extensive and important one, and that part of the narrative around Mary's legacy of this house is that she has the unfortunate pejorative colloquialism of being the witch of Fox Point placed on her because she was a single woman living by herself, making work. And so to change that narrative around her and her time there and to look at these issues of these very important issues of feminism and gender theory that are really present in this moment, and to use the site as a platform for scholarship around those things, make it an important place to really focus on bringing back to how Mary had it. Yeah. And we had to decide on a date with which to do all this work towards, and 1998 was this moment where there was a critical mass. You can see these sculptures on the roof. Working with Karen, and we have a committee within the Art Center that we talk about all these major decisions that both everything from aesthetics to how we deal with the village of Fox Point, so that we kind of bring these decisions through the committee to try to do the best in Mary's legacy. And so 98 is kind of the year that we're working towards, since there's such a huge time period that she was working on this, that we're gonna, hopefully put the sculptures back on the roof and like really make the site feel the way that she had it at its kind of pinnacle. These are some of the panels, the masonite panels I was talking about. So that's the side that had been facing the outside, and then on the back you have these paintings. Yeah, they're unbelievable. So, these are reproductions. So that's an original that was those red figures. So that's all.
I'm just going to comment on Alex's comment about how there were no foundations and they weren't necessarily built to last. I have 3 words to comment on that. Frank Lloyd Wright. So it's not just the artists who have issues with permanence. I think I'll start with my personal journey here because it seems like that's what happens at the conference. People talk about how they came to be interested in this kind of stuff. And, in 1985, I was living in Pasadena, California. I got a job there as a historic preservation planner. And I was a big fan of modern African music. And I heard about this African music festival that was going to be happening in Watts, and it happened to be at Watts Tower. And I had no idea what Watts Tower was. I came there, and like many people have commented, were just totally destroyed by what an amazing property that was. And it whetted my appetite for these kinds of environments. And so while I was living in California, I visited some of the better known ones like Grandma Prisby's Bottle Village and Nitwit Ridge. And in the summer of 1987, I decided to take a job at the Wisconsin Historical Society running the National Register of Historic Places program. So we loaded our cats in our unair-conditioned Toyota Tercel and headed across Death Valley. I wouldn't recommend that with cats in the back. And started driving to Wisconsin. And along the way, we decided to make one stop. And we stopped at the Garden of Eden in Lucas. And it was 107 degrees that day. Remember the cats in the unconditioned, air-conditioned Toyota Tercel? So we drove there, and I said, we just have to stop. We'd driven out of our way. It's not straight from California. So we'd driven out of our way to get there, and we parked the car hoping we weren't going to kill the cats while we were touring it. And we went inside. I hope it's air conditioned now because that second floor in 1987 was excruciatingly hot. It was so hot that the docent said, "You can go up there, but I'm not going to go up there." So we went up there, and it was so hot in that attic that you could hardly breathe. I mean, I was just gasping for air. And but that is such an exceptional site, and that was a moment of discovery for me. So I came to Wisconsin, started working in the National Register program, and I found in the files a National Register nomination that was written in the early 1980s that attempted to list 8 sites in Wisconsin on the National Register, all in one nomination form. They used to let you do stuff like that. And it was rejected by the National Park Service. They turned it back. And what they said in their comments, which I think is a lesson to all of us, is that they lacked the historic context to be able to understand the significance of these sites. And because there wasn't a sufficient historic context, they said you can't nominate these things. that stuck in my craw. It seems that the significance of these sites are intrinsic. You can just look at them and you know they're significant. When you go to the Garden of Eden and you glance at those amazing sculptures, you know it's something really special. But that's not how the National Register works. It's based on historical documentation. And what they said is there's not any real scholarship about this stuff yet. And we don't know what defines a good one, what's significant among this work. And, those were valid criticisms, I think. And but I never, I kept thinking about those sites. And one day my wife and I were vacationing up in northern Wisconsin. And on our way back, we decided to go down Highway 13, and we visited this modest little site that you've seen some of called the Wisconsin Concrete Park, with its 237 full-size concrete sculptures. And I'm wandering around the grounds, and I'm a cocky guy. I think I know what I'm talking about. And I meet this woman on the site, and I start talking to her about it and kind of pontificating about it. And she gave me a very swift and brutal dressing down. Her name is Lisa Stone, and she is in the room here today. And, that's where my real education about these sites began. Lisa quite ably demonstrated I had no idea what I was talking about. And I love her to this day for that. But that's where my interest began in these sites. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the nuts and bolts of how the world of historic preservation integrates with these sites. And because I'm a historian, I have to go back to the beginning. The Historic Preservation Act of 1966, which celebrated its 50th anniversary last year, was a landmark piece of legislation in the history of preservation. Much of the preservation movement, as we know it today, was founded by the passage of that act. Before 1966, historic preservation was a local thing. There were no professional standards. There weren't any standards for work. There wasn't really a profession of trained preservationists. And it was a very, very poorly organized movement. And the passage of the Preservation Act was really spurred by the role of the federal government in a lot of grand programs that were developed in the 1950s and 60s. The urban renewal program, which we like to call urban removal, because that's what it did really well. It tore the hearts out of cities and took neighborhoods that were blighted and destroyed them for new development that never followed. The Interstate Highway Act, which plowed interstate freeways through farmland and into cities, and all of those things were done without any regard for whether there was something historic in their path or not. And it was the result of those actions that spurred the federal government to say, well, we really need to look at what the role of the federal government is in the leadership of historic preservation, and we need to develop a framework for historic preservation. And this slide, these images I'm showing right here, this is the Plankington Mansion in Milwaukee, which was one of the finest, perhaps the finest Victorian house in the city of Milwaukee. It was that the second slide was the day after Marquette University drove a bulldozer into the front porch of the building, purposefully damaging the building so they could have an excuse to take it down. And as a result of that, Milwaukee passed its first historic preservation ordinance. It was a devastating loss for the city. So as a result of the Preservation Act, they created the National Register of Historic Places. And the National Register, as the Park Service likes to say, is the nation's official federal list of buildings, sites, structures, and objects worthy of preservation. And the idea behind the National Register when it started was just a bureaucrat's tool. If you're going to protect properties from federal action, you have to know which ones are historic. And before that, there wasn't any measure really of what significance was and how property could be considered to be historically significant. So the National Register was meant to be that benchmark that says this is what a historic property is, so that federal bureaucrats, if you're a highway planner or you work for HUD or the Army Corps of Engineers, you can look at a list and say, oh, that building's on that list or that site is on that list. We have to take that in consideration when we're doing our project planning. It was as simple as that. So it was meant to just be a objective measure of what was historically significant. So the National Register began just as a friendly bureaucrat's tool, but it became more than that, because once the federal government got in the business of deeming things to be historically significant, people began to understand that there was a whole honorific nature to that designation too. It's not an easy thing to get a property listed on the National Register, and the process is somewhat demanding. So going through that process, in the end, you get a definitive designation that says that your property is historically significant. And I know that's a battle that a lot of you who are stewards of these sites fight, that you're fighting for the validity of the site. That people are saying, oh, that's just a pile of junk out there. Why don't you just bulldoze that thing? The National Register gives you some uncontested status that your property is historically significant and it's something that's worth preservation. The National Register is not regulatory to the property owners. That's one of the biggest myth about the National Register is if you get something listed on the register, you can't tear it down and you can't change it without somebody telling you can change it. All of that's totally false. You know, every year in Wisconsin, we got roughly about 4,000 listings on the National Register. Every year, some of those are torn down. And there's nothing in the National Register status that can prevent that from happening. What it regulates is the government. So when there is federal funding, licensing, or permitting involved that affects a property, that triggers a process in federal law called Section 106. And Section 106 is your friend because the federal government has their fingers in everything. And so, you know, in my office, we review about 4,000 projects a year that are anything from cell phone towers to Army Corps of Engineers permits, farm service loans, small business loans, federal road aids, which go all the way down to the level of local streets. And we are the negotiator with that federal agency on what the impact of that project is on historic properties. So we ask them to look at their project design, see if something can be changed in the project design, if it's going to have an effect on a historic property and all that. And that can be helpful to you if you're a site steward and you find yourself running afoul of some federal process. Probably the most important thing about the process of National Register listing is the process of completing the National Register form and going through the documentation to document the significance of the site. Not only do you have to describe what the site is physically, you also have to say, you have to present the context in which this site was born, and then document in great detail every aspect of the site. So Lisa Stone took on the nomination of the Wisconsin Concrete Park, which you see a photo of in my PowerPoint. And I think Lisa, I'm probably accurate in saying you had no idea how much documentation would be required and the kind of arduous nature of going through that process. But in the end, in going through it, it's a great exercise because you understand the site better as a result. It's a good document that lasts into the future, archived at the National Archives, that gives really good documentation, a good snapshot at that particular point in time of what that property was. The status of National Register is also something that's very useful in your community. It's useful from an advocacy standpoint. It's also useful in fundraising because funders want to know that they're giving money to something that's important. And that's one of the arguments that you can use for importance in getting it designated. Now, in all of that, there are some special issues related to these arts environments. The National Register is something that's called the 50-year rule. A property has to have been around for more than 50 years in order for it to be nominated, unless you can demonstrate it's of exceptional importance. Now, the 50-year rule is really a guideline. It's not a rule, but if you talk to people in the Park Service, they call it the 50-year rule. So it means you have a higher burden of proof if your property is less than 50 years old, and you have to do more extensive documentation to make your case for that property, but it's not insurmountable. One of the caveats is that if it is a work of an artist, that artist must have stopped working on the work, so it's not evolving anymore. The National Register kind of looks at something as a snapshot of when when it's finished. So if it's not being finished, you're not at the point where you can nominate it yet. I think another obstacle is just that the National Register requires that you have historic documentation. As you know, some of these sites are not well documented in the written historical record, and that can be an issue as well. With the Mary Knoll House, we nominated that a few years ago, and the National Register has 3 levels of significance. Locally level, important to the community. Statewide level, important to the history of the state. Nationally significant. We tried to nominate Mary Knoll for national significance, and I truly believe it's a nationally significant site, partly because it was built by a woman, and there are so few of those. The National Register staff turned us down on that and said, you just don't have significant written documentation that demonstrates from a historical perspective the significance that this particular site has in American history. There's not enough documentation. Enough scholars have not studied the site and looked at it from a national perspective. So that's my challenge to you folks out in the room there, is do that research and do that documentation, because that's so important in getting through the listing process. And it's not over till it's over, so we can always come back in the future and amend that nomination and add that national significance, which I believe is there. So I'm going to go really quickly through the process of getting a property on the National Register. The process starts with the State Historic Preservation Office. I'm the State Historic Preservation Officer. I'm just going to make a disclaimer. I don't preserve squat. I don't preserve anything. The only thing I can take credit for preserving is my 1936 International Style house, which I probably saved from being a teardown. It was in really bad shape. But it's you folks who preserve things. All of you in this room preserve things. What the preservation officer does is just help to facilitate the process whenever we can be helpful. So the process of National Register begins with the State Historic Preservation Office. Every state has one. Nominations have to run this through a process that typically takes about a year from beginning to end, and culminates with the Historic Preservation Review Board. It's a governor-appointed board. Every state has one. It's their authority to pass judgment on these properties and whether they are historically significant or not. And then if they have given it a thumbs up or a thumbs down, then the State Historic Preservation Officer is allowed to weigh in too. It goes on to the National Park Service for approval. The picture here, by the way, is Bird Park. It's listed on the National Register. It's a poured concrete structure that was the home of an artist that did bird art. You can see a couple of pieces up on the peak of the roof. It originally had hundreds of pieces, quite a number of which are now in the Kohler collection. Then there's another type of designation that occurs locally. And this is where the teeth come in for preservation. Local units of government can designate things as historic through the zoning powers of the community. So every time you hear a story about that property couldn't be altered or couldn't be torn down because it was on the National Register, it's actually a local landmark listing that controls that. Because it's in the zoning power that's important. So it regulates property, it can deny changes, and it can deny demolition. That's a photo from the Grandview in Hollandale. All these properties are listed. So I'm just going to wrap up here by saying we can help. We have advocacy tools on our website. We have a very comprehensive web site that was built for preservation advocacy. So we tell you everything you need to do to be effective advocates, from how do you raise money to how do you talk to local units of government, how do you find the right people for your board, all of that kind of nuts and bolts of advocacy. We have preservation funding sources. Some of these are national, some are Wisconsin only. You can search those for historic preservation funding and find a brief overview of all of those. And we have a lot of historic building best practices. We've done a very comprehensive encyclopedia of preservation practices that affect historic buildings. Some of these are easily transferable to the sites that tell you how to diagnose problems, what proper treatments are, all of that. And with that, I'm going to wrap up.